Join us for a heartfelt journey of healing and second chances at Monteverde Farm, where Julia, escaping an abusive relationship, finds unexpected love with Fernando, a kind-hearted farm owner. Their story reminds us that even our deepest wounds can heal with patience, understanding, and genuine love. Before we begin this story, comment below where you're watching from. The morning traffic in downtown Chicago blared outside Julia's apartment window as she packed the last of her clothes into a worn suitcase. At 25, her life had become a series of disappointments and painful memories. The bruise on her wrist had faded, but the emotional scars from her relationship with Mark still felt fresh. "You're doing the right thing," said her roommate Pam, leaning against the doorframe. "Getting away from this city is exactly what you need." Julia nodded without looking up. "I know. I just never thought I'd end up running away." "It's not running away," Pam insisted. "It's moving forward. There's a difference." Julia zipped her suitcase closed and finally looked around the small bedroom that had been her home for the past 3 years. The walls still showed faint outlines where pictures once hung, photos of happier times that she'd taken down weeks ago, unable to look at them anymore. "My cousin Rachel says the job is just temporary," Julia said, tucking a strand of brown hair behind her ear. 3 months helping in the kitchen at some farm in the middle of nowhere. Green Mountain Farm, right? Monteverde Farm, Julia corrected. "It's Spanish for Green Mountain," Pam smiled. "Fancy name for a bunch of cows and chickens." The taxi honked outside and Julia's shoulders tensed. This was it. She was leaving everything behind. Her apartment, her failed career as a sous chef at Marco's restaurant, and the memories of Mark's controlling behavior that had escalated from criticism to outright abuse. "Call me when you get there," Pam said, hugging her. "And remember, no one there knows anything about you. You can be whoever you want to be." Julia nodded, but she already knew who she would be. Invisible. It was safer that way. The countryside stretched endlessly outside the bus window. After a 4-hour ride, Julia was the last passenger remaining when the driver called out, "Monteverde Farm stop," as requested. The bus pulled away, leaving her standing by a wooden sign with Monteverde Farm carved into it. A dirt road stretched ahead, flanked by green pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, so different from the concrete jungle she'd left behind. Julia pulled her suitcase along the gravel path, her city shoes already collecting dust. The main house appeared in the distance, a large 2-story farmhouse with a wide porch and rocking chairs. Behind it, she could see several barns and smaller buildings scattered across the property. A woman in her early 40s stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You must be Julia," she called out, waving. "I'm Rachel's mom, Martha. Welcome to Monteverde." Julia forced a smile. "Thank you for having me." "Nonsense. We're grateful you agreed to help in the kitchen. Our last cook left without notice, and with harvest season coming up, we need all hands on deck." Martha took Julia's suitcase. "Let me show you to your room and then you can freshen up before dinner." The inside of the farmhouse was surprisingly spacious, with wooden floors that creaked under their feet. Martha led her upstairs to a small but cozy bedroom with a view of the fields. "Bathrooms down the hall, shared with 2 of our seasonal workers. The ranch hands have their own quarters near the stables." Martha placed the suitcase on the bed. "Dinner's at 6 in the main dining room. Most of the workers eat there together." When Martha left, Julia sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed. She'd traded the noise of the city for an unfamiliar silence, broken only by distant animal sounds and the whisper of wind through trees. Part of her wanted to call Pam and beg her to send money for a return ticket, but she knew there was nothing to go back to. She changed into jeans and a plain grey t-shirt, pulling her hair back into a tight bun. Looking in the small mirror above the dresser, she hardly recognized herself. The sparkle that once lit her eyes was gone, replaced by a cautious wariness. It was better this way, she told herself. Don't stand out. Don't attract attention. Adi. Exactly 6 o'clock, Julia made her way downstairs, following the sounds of conversation and the smell of home cooking. The dining room contained a long wooden table where about a dozen people were already seated, passing dishes family style. "Everyone, this is Julia from Chicago," Martha announced. "She'll be helping Maria in the kitchen for the harvest season." Julia scanned the faces around the table, mostly men, ranch hands with weathered skin and friendly smiles that she didn't trust. She nodded curtly and took the empty seat beside an older woman who must be Maria. "I start work tomorrow?" Julia asked. Quietly, Maria nodded. "Breakfast prep begins at 5. I hope you're an early riser." Julia wasn't, but she would be. Anything to keep busy and avoid thinking about the life she'd left behind. The meal continued with conversation flowing around her. Julia answered direct questions politely but briefly, offering no additional information about herself. As plates were being cleared, the front door opened, and the room fell momentarily silent. A tall man entered, removing his cowboy hat as he stepped inside. He had dark hair tinged with early gray at the temples, a strong jawline covered with stubble, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Unlike the other ranch hands, he wore a button-down shirt with his jeans, sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms. "Sorry I'm late," he said, nodding to Martha. "Had to finish with the new calf." "Fernando, come meet our new kitchen help." Martha waved him over. "This is Julia from Chicago. Julia, this is Fernando Montero, the owner of Monteverde." Julia felt her body tense as he approached. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the wooden table grain. "Welcome to Monteverde," Fernando said, his voice deeper than she expected, with just a hint of an accent. "I hope you'll be comfortable here." She forced herself to look up, and immediately regretted it. His eyes were kind, the deep brown of coffee beans, and they seemed to see right through her carefully constructed walls. She quickly looked away. "Thank you," she mumbled, standing abruptly. "If you'll excuse me, I should get some rest before tomorrow." She felt his eyes on her as she left, and it made her skin prickle. Not with fear exactly, but with awareness. And that was dangerous. In her experience, men were only kind when they wanted something. She'd learned that lesson the hard way with Mark. Back in her room, Julia pushed the small dresser against the door, not enough to block it completely, but enough to make noise if anyone tried to enter. She curled up on the bed, clutching her pillow tightly against her chest like a shield. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of Mark's angry voice and of dark, kind eyes that somehow seemed just as threatening. The next few days fell into a routine. Julia arrived in the kitchen before dawn, working silently beside Maria to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. She learned the rhythm of farm life, early mornings, hearty meals, and the constant cycle of chores that kept the place running. She avoided Fernando as much as possible, though she often felt his gaze on her when they were in the same room. Unlike Mark, he never raised his voice, never demanded attention. In fact, he rarely spoke at all except when necessary. There was a quietness about him that both intrigued and unnerved her. One week into her stay, Julia was chopping vegetables for the evening stew when Maria handed her a note. "Fernando asks if you would prepare something special for a business dinner tomorrow night, just for him and 2 guests. Julia's hand tightened around the knife. "I'm not a chef," she said. "I'm just here to help." Maria smiled. "Rachel told Martha, you worked in a restaurant in Chicago. Fernando thought you might enjoy creating something different for a change." Julia felt trapped. She didn't want to call attention to herself, but refusing might raise questions she didn't want to answer. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll need a list of what ingredients are available." The next evening, Julia found herself alone in the kitchen, preparing a meal she had once been proud of. Braised short ribs with roasted vegetables and a red wine reduction. The familiar process of cooking calmed her, and for brief moments she forgot where she was and why. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear Fernando enter until he spoke. "It smells wonderful in here." Julia jumped, nearly dropping the wooden spoon she was holding. She spun around, instinctively backing against the counter. Fernando held up his hands. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." Julia forced herself to breathe. "It's fine, dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. He didn't leave as she expected. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. The silence stretched between them until she couldn't bear it. "Is there something else you need?" she asked, more sharply than intended. "No," he said simply. "I just enjoy watching." Someone who knows what they're doing. There was no mockery in his voice, only genuine appreciation. Julia didn't know how to respond to that. Mark had always criticized her cooking, finding fault with even her best efforts. "Your guests will be waiting," she said finally. Fernando straightened. "They just called. They're running late, traffic from the city." He hesitated. "Would you join me for a glass of wine while we wait? I opened a bottle that pairs well with your meal." Julia stiffened. "No, thank you. I have work to finish." She turned back to the stove, making it clear the conversation was over. She heard him sigh softly before leaving, and only then did she release the breath she'd been holding. Later that night, after serving the meal and cleaning the kitchen, Julia sat alone on the back porch steps. The night was clear, stars visible, in a way they never were in Chicago. She wrapped her arms around herself, fighting a sudden wave of loneliness. "May I join you?" Julia startled at Fernando's voice. He stood a respectful distance away, holding 2 mugs. Every instinct told her to leave, to retreat to the safety of her room. But something, perhaps the quietness of the night or the weariness in his expression, made her nod slightly. He sat on the opposite end of the step, leaving plenty of space between them. "Hot chocolate," he said, offering her one of the mugs. "My mother's recipe." Julia hesitated before accepting it. The ceramic was warm against her palms. "The dinner was excellent," Fernando said after a moment. "You're very talented." Julia took a sip of the hot chocolate to avoid responding. It was rich and not too sweet, with a hint of cinnamon. "You don't like compliments," he observed. "I don't like," she began, then stopped herself. "I don't like men who think they own you because they said something nice." Fernando seemed to understand what she didn't say. "You don't have to talk to me, Julia, but I want you to know that here no one will hurt you. You're safe at Monteverde." The kindness in his voice almost undid her. She stood abruptly, handing him back the mug. "Thank you for the hot chocolate. Mr. Montero, good night." As she hurried back to her room, Julia felt tears threatening. She hadn't cried since leaving Chicago, not even when Mark had called her cell phone repeatedly until she'd been forced to change her number. She wouldn't cry. Now tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Because crying meant feeling, and feeling meant vulnerability, and she'd promised herself she would never be vulnerable again. 2 weeks passed at Monteverde Farm. Julia settled into a routine that felt almost safe. Wake before dawn, prepare. Breakfast with Maria, clean up, begin lunch preparations, serve, clean again, then start on dinner. The repetitive tasks kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. She still kept to herself, eating quickly and retreating to her room or taking walks alone around the property when her kitchen duties were finished. The farm workers had learned not to approach her directly, sending their compliments about her cooking through Maria instead. One rainy Tuesday morning, Julia was kneading bread dough when Maria announced she needed to visit her sister in the neighboring town. "Her baby is coming early," Maria explained, already untying her apron. "I must go today." Julia felt panic rising. "But what about lunch and dinner?" "You know what to do," Maria said confidently. "You're a better cook than me anyway. Fernando already said it's fine for me to go." After Maria left, the kitchen felt too big, too empty. Julia worked methodically, trying to ignore the anxiety bubbling inside her. Without Maria as a buffer, she would have to interact with the others more directly. The rain intensified throughout the morning, drumming against the kitchen windows. By lunchtime, it was pouring so hard that the ranch hands came in dripping wet, their boots leaving muddy tracks on the floor. "Sorry about the mess," said Tom, one of the older workers. Storm came up fast. Julia nodded without meeting his eyes, setting out the chicken stew and freshly baked bread she'd prepared. She served them quickly, then retreated to the far end of the kitchen, busying herself with washing pots. Fernando arrived late, his shirt soaked through. "The creek's rising," he told the men. "We need to move the cattle from the lower pasture after lunch." His eyes found Julia across the room. "This stew is exactly what we needed today. Thank you." Julia gave a small nod of acknowledgement before turning back to her task. She could feel his gaze lingering on her, but he didn't approach. After the men left for the afternoon chores, Julia cleaned the dining room and began preparing for dinner. The storm continued to rage outside, lightning flashing across the darkened sky followed by rumbling thunder that seemed to shake the house. She was reaching for a large pot on a high shelf when a particularly loud crash of thunder startled her. The pot slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor with a deafening bang. Julia gasped, instinctively backing against the wall, her heart racing. "Are you okay?" Fernando stood in the doorway, rainwater dripping from his hair and clothes. His sudden appearance, combined with the noise and the storm, sent Julia into a momentary panic. She slid down the wall, her breathing shallow and quick. Instead of approaching her, Fernando stayed where he was, his voice gentle. "It's just a storm, Julia. You're safe here." She couldn't respond, trapped in a memory of Mark throwing pots when dinner wasn't to his liking, corners of the kitchen where she'd huddled to avoid his rage. Fernando seemed to understand. He slowly lowered himself to sit on the floor, keeping the entire width of the kitchen between them. "Here, no one yells at you. No one makes you feel less. You can breathe." His words, so simple and direct, broke through her panic. Julia took a shuddering breath, then another. Tears welled up and spilled over, running down her cheeks. For the first time since arriving at Monteverde, she cried, not the silent tears she'd shed in Chicago, but deep, body-shaking sobs. Fernando remained where he was, a steady presence across the room. He didn't try to comfort her physically or tell her to stop crying. He simply waited, giving her the space and time she needed. When her tears finally subsided, Julia felt hollow, but somehow lighter, as if something poisonous had been drained. "Away, I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping her face with her sleeve. "Never apologize for feelings," Fernando said. "They're honest, even when people aren't." He stood slowly. "The storm's getting worse. I need to check on the animals, but I'll be back before dinner." He paused at the door. "Julia, thank you for trusting me enough to be yourself, even for a moment." After he left, Julia remained on the floor for several minutes, processing what had happened. No man had ever seen her break down like that, without either mocking her or trying to fix her. Fernando had done neither. He had simply been there, steady as the earth beneath the farm. She finally stood, picked up the fallen pot, and returned to her work. But something had shifted inside her, the smallest crack in the wall she'd built around herself. By evening, the storm had intensified into something fierce and wild. Wind howled around the farmhouse, and rain lashed against the windows like tiny bullets. Most of the farm workers had moved to the bunkhouse earlier, but Fernando and two of the senior hands stayed in the main house to monitor the situation. "The creek's overflowed," Tom reported after checking outside, "but the animals are all secure in the high barns." Julia served a simple dinner of beef stew and cornbread, which the men ate quickly before returning to their watch by the windows. She cleaned up alone, listening to their low voices discussing water levels and property damage. As she was finishing, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. "Everyone stay calm," Fernando's voice came from the living room. "The generator should kick in soon." Julia froze in the dark kitchen, her hand gripping the edge of the sink. She heard footsteps approaching and tensed. "Julia?" Fernando called softly. "Are you still in here?" "Yes," she answered, her voice barely audible over the storm. A beam of light appeared as Fernando entered with a flashlight. "The generator should start any minute, but I've got candles just in case. Are you okay with the dark?" The truth was, she wasn't. Dark apartments had meant Mark was in one of his moods, forcing her to navigate by memory and touch to avoid disturbing him. "I'm fine," she lied. Fernando didn't challenge her, but he left the flashlight on the counter. "Keep this with you. I need to check on something outside." "In this storm?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "The generator's in a shed behind the house. It should have started automatically, but sometimes the switch sticks." He grabbed a raincoat from a hook by the back door. "I'll be right back." Alone in the dark kitchen with only the flashlight beam for company, Julia felt unexpectedly worried for Fernando. The storm was dangerous, and he was going out into it alone. Before she could analyze this new feeling, the back door opened again, bringing with it a gust of wind and rain. Fernando stepped inside, soaking wet despite the raincoat. "The path to the generator shed is flooded," he reported. "We'll have to make do with candles tonight." He shook off his coat and retrieved several large candles from a cabinet, lighting them and placing them around the kitchen and dining room. The warm glow created a cozy atmosphere despite the raging storm outside. "The phones are down too," he said, running a hand through his damp hair. "But we've weathered worse storms than this. The house is solid." Julia nodded, watching the candlelight play across his features. For the first time, she allowed herself to really look at him. The strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right eyebrow, the depth of his eyes that seemed to hold both strength and sorrow. "You should get some rest," Fernando suggested. "There's nothing more to do tonight." Julia hesitated. The thought of being alone in her dark room suddenly seemed less appealing than staying in the candlelit kitchen. "I thought I might make some tea first," she said. If Fernando was surprised by her decision to stay, he didn't show it. "Tea sounds good. Mind if I join you?" She shook her head, and he sat at the kitchen table while she filled the kettle. Thankfully, the stove was gas and still worked without electricity. The simple act of making tea in the storm-darkened kitchen felt strangely intimate. When Julia placed a steaming mug in front of Fernando, their fingers brushed briefly. She didn't flinch away as she would have days earlier. "Thank you," he said. They sat in silence for a while, the storm providing a dramatic backdrop to the quiet. Kitchen scene. Julia cradled her mug, drawing comfort from its warmth. "How long have you owned Monteverde?" she finally asked, surprising herself with the question. Fernando looked up, a flicker of something, pleasure perhaps, crossing his face at her initiative. "It's been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather started with just 50 acres and a dream. My father expanded it to what you see now." He paused. "I took over 10 years ago after they passed." "You run it well," Julia said, then added softly, "Everyone respects you here." "Respect is earned through fairness, not fear," Fernando replied. "My father taught me that." Julia stared into her tea. Mark had ruled through fear, measuring his success by how quickly she jumped to obey. Not everyone sees it that way. Fernando was quiet for a moment. "No, not everyone does." He seemed to choose his next words carefully. "Julia, whatever happened to you before you came here, it wasn't your fault." She looked up sharply. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you're strong," he said simply. "I know you're rebuilding yourself piece by piece, and I know that whoever hurt you was wrong." Julia felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. "I don't want to talk about that." "We don't have to," Fernando assured her. "But if you ever do, I'm a good listener." The wind howled particularly loudly, rattling the windows. Julia jumped slightly, and without thinking, Fernando reached across the table. He stopped just short of touching her hand, leaving the choice to her. After a moment's hesitation, Julia allowed her fingers to rest lightly against his. It was the first time she had willingly touched a man since leaving Chicago. Fernando's hand was warm and calloused from farm work, steady beneath her trembling fingers. They stayed like that for several heartbeats, connected by the lightest of touches while the storm raged outside. Then Julia gently withdrew her hand and stood. "I should go to bed," she said. Fernando nodded, rising as well. "Take a candle with you, and Julia, thank you for the tea and the company." In her room, Julia placed the candle on her nightstand and sat on the edge of her bed. Her hand still tingled where it had touched Fernando's. Instead of feeling afraid or anxious, she felt calm. She didn't push the dresser against the door that night, and for the first time since arriving at Monteverde, she slept without clutching her pillow like a shield. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had never happened. The power was still out, but Fernando and the ranch hands were already assessing damage and beginning repairs. Julia prepared a simple breakfast of cold cereal and fruit, carrying a tray out to the men working on clearing a fallen tree near the house. "You're an angel," Tom said gratefully, taking a bowl. Fernando looked up from where he was operating a chainsaw, surprise registering on his face at the sight of Julia voluntarily approaching the group. He set down the saw and wiped his brow with his forearm before accepting the food she offered. "Thank you," he said. "This is thoughtful of you." Julia gave a small shrug. "You've been working since dawn. You must be hungry." She didn't linger, returning to the kitchen to continue her preparations for lunch. But throughout the morning, she found herself glancing out the window to watch Fernando directing the cleanup efforts. There was something reassuring about his calm authority, the way he worked alongside his men rather than simply giving orders. Maria returned that afternoon, full of apologies and news about her new nephew. She took one look at Julia and paused. "Something's different about you," she observed. Julia turned away, focusing on chopping vegetables. "Nothing's different. How's your sister?" Maria allowed the subject change, launching into details about the birth and the baby. But her eyes remained curious as she watched Julia working with a new ease in her movements, a slight relaxation in her perpetually tense shoulders. That evening, after dinner was served and cleaned up, Julia surprised herself again by accepting Fernando's invitation to sit on the porch. The night air was cool and fresh after the storm, carrying the scent of wet earth and growing things. "The power company says we should have electricity back by morning," Fernando said, rocking gently in his chair. Julia nodded, watching fireflies begin to appear in the gathering dusk. "It's peaceful without it, though." Fernando smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Yes, it is." A comfortable silence settled between them. Julia had forgotten what it felt like to simply be in someone's presence without fear or anxiety. It felt like the first deep breath after being underwater too long. "I was engaged once," Fernando said suddenly, still looking out at the fields. "Laura was from the city like you. She loved the idea of farm life, the romance of it, but the reality," he shook his head. "The mud, the early mornings, the endless work. It wasn't what she expected." Julia turned to look at him, surprised by this personal revelation. "What happened?" "She left," he said simply. "Went back to the city and her office job. Said she couldn't waste her youth buried in the countryside." He glanced at Julia. "I don't blame her. This life isn't for everyone." "Is that why you never married?" Julia asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." "It's fine," Fernando assured her, "and partly yes, but it's also—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I watched my sister marry a man who changed once the ring was on her finger. He became controlling, then verbally abusive, and finally—" He stopped, pain evident in his voice. Julia's heart clenched. "What happened to her?" Fernando's hands gripped the arms of his rocking chair. "She died in what was ruled an accident, a fall down the stairs. But I knew. We all knew." "I'm so sorry," Julia whispered. "I couldn't protect her," Fernando continued. "I tried to get her to leave him, but she was afraid. And then it was too late." He looked directly at Julia. "Since then, I've promised myself I would never ignore the signs, never pretend not to see when someone is hurting." Julia understood then why he had been so careful with her, so respectful of her boundaries. He recognized her pain because he had seen it before. "My ex-boyfriend, Mark," she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue after so long avoiding it. "He didn't hit me at first. It was little things, criticizing my cooking, my clothes, my friends, then controlling my time, my money. When I finally tried to leave—" She trailed off, unconsciously rubbing her wrist where the bruises had been. Fernando didn't push for details. "You did leave, though. That takes courage." "Or desperation," Julia countered. "Sometimes they're the same thing." They fell silent again, each lost in memories. After a while, Fernando stood. "I should check on the repairs before turning in. Good night, Julia." "Fernando?" she called as he reached the door. When he turned, she said softly, "Thank you. For not pushing. For not trying to fix me." His expression was gentle in the fading light. "You're not broken, Julia. Wounded, maybe. But healing, I think." After he left, Julia remained on the porch, his words echoing in her mind. For the first time since arriving at Monteverde, she felt something new unfurling inside her, something that felt dangerously like hope. As weeks turned into months, summer's heat gave way to the first crisp hints of fall at Monteverde Farm. The fields changed from vibrant green to gold, and the harvest season began in earnest. With it came longer workdays and busier evenings as the farm workers brought in crops and prepared for winter. Julia found herself settling into a rhythm she hadn't expected to enjoy. Her days in the kitchen with Maria took on a comfortable familiarity, and she no longer hurried to her room after meals. Instead, she often lingered, listening to the ranch hands' stories or watching as Fernando reviewed the day's progress with his team. One cool September evening, Julia was kneading dough for the next morning's breakfast when Fernando appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I was in town today," he said, setting the package on the counter. "Thought you might like this." Julia wiped flour from her hands before carefully unwrapping the paper. Inside was a cookbook, not new and shiny, but well worn with dog-eared pages and handwritten notes in the margins. "It was my grandmother's," Fernando explained. "All the family recipes are in there, including her famous apple pie. I noticed you like to bake." Julia ran her fingers over the faded cover. "This feels too precious to use. Books are meant to be. Read recipes meant to be cooked," Fernando said with a small smile. "She would have liked you to have it." Their eyes met, and Julia felt a flutter in her chest that had become increasingly familiar in Fernando's presence. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll take good care of it." He nodded, seeming about to say something more, but Tom appeared at the door. "Boss, the tractor's acting up again. Henderson thinks it's the transmission." Fernando sighed. "I'll be right." "There?" He gave Julia one last look before following Tom out. Maria, who had been discreetly wiping down the stove during this exchange, raised an eyebrow when they were alone. "That man has never given anyone his grandmother's cookbook, not even—" "Laura?" Julia felt her cheeks warm. "We're just friends." "Mm-hmm," Maria hummed, not bothering to hide her knowing smile. Later that evening, after the kitchen was clean, Julia took the cookbook to the small garden behind the house. It was her favorite spot to sit when the day's work was done. A peaceful place with stone benches surrounded by late-blooming flowers. She carefully turned the pages, admiring the neat handwriting that annotated many of the recipes. "Add more cinnamon," one note read. "Let rise overnight for best results," said another. It felt like reading someone's life story through their kitchen adventures. "Finding anything interesting?" Fernando's voice startled her, but not in the fearful way she once would have reacted. She looked up to see him standing at the garden entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. "Your grandmother was very specific about her pie crust technique," Julia said, showing him a page filled. With precise instructions, Fernando laughed, a warm sound that Julia had come to cherish. She believed pie crust was the true measure of a baker. "My grandfather proposed to her after tasting her apple pie." "A man who knows his priorities," Julia joked, surprising herself with the ease of the banter. Fernando sat beside her on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them as he always did. "My grandmother would have liked you," he said. "She valued people who put their heart into their work." Julia closed the book carefully. "I haven't always. When I worked at the restaurant in Chicago, it became just a job, something to get through." She paused. "But here, it feels different." "How so?" She thought for a moment. "People appreciate what I make, not just with words, but—" She struggled to explain. "They enjoy it. There's satisfaction in creating something that brings others happiness." Fernando nodded. "That's how I feel about the farm. It's not just work, it's creating something meaningful." He looked out at the fields stretching beyond the garden. "When my father died, everyone expected me to sell Monteverde, move to the city, get a real job, as they called it." "Why didn't you?" "Because this land is part of me," he said simply. "The seasons, the animals, the rhythm of planting and harvesting, it's in my blood." He glanced at her. "Not everyone understands that kind of connection." "I think I'm beginning to," Julia admitted. They sat in comfortable silence as dusk deepened. Around them, fireflies began to dance among the garden plants, their tiny lights blinking on and off like earthbound stars. "Julia," Fernando said quietly, "the Harvest Festival is this weekend in town. Would you consider going with me?" Her pulse quickened. This sounded suspiciously like a date, something she hadn't been ready to consider since arriving at Monte Verde. I don't know. Just as friends, he added quickly. The whole farm goes. It's a community tradition. Good food, music, dancing if you want, but no pressure. The old fear whispered warnings in her mind, but Julia found herself nodding. Okay, as friends. Fernando's smile was worth the flutter of anxiety his invitation had triggered. Good. It settled then. The morning of the festival dawned bright and clear. Julia stood in front of the small mirror in her room, frowning at her reflection. She had brought few clothes from Chicago and nothing appropriate for a festival. After trying on and discarding several options, she finally settled. On her least worn jeans and a simple blue blouse, a knock at her door made her jump. Maria stood there holding a beautiful floral dress in soft yellow. My daughter left this last time she visited, Maria said. It's not her color, but it would look lovely on you. Julia hesitated. I couldn't. Please, Maria insisted. She would be happy for you to wear it. 20 minutes later, Julia descended the stairs, feeling both self-conscious and pretty for the first time in months. The dress fit well, flowing around her knees, and Maria had helped her style her hair in loose waves instead of her usual severe bun. Fernando was waiting in the foyer, dressed in clean jeans and a crisp white shirt. When he saw her, he went completely, still his eyes widening slightly. You look beautiful, he said, his voice lower than usual. Julia felt herself blushing. Thank you. Maria lent me the dress. He offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. Shall we? The others have already gone. Ahead. The drive into town was filled with an electric sort of tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. Julia kept her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of Fernando beside her, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his hands moved confidently on the steering wheel. The town square had been transformed for the Harvest Festival. Stalls lined the perimeter selling food, crafts, and local produce. A band played lively music on a small stage, while children ran through the crowd with face paint and balloons. This is wonderful, Julia said, taking in the sights and sounds. Fernando smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. Wait until you try Mrs. Peterson's apple cider. It's famous in 3 counties. They walked through the festival together, stopping to chat with townspeople who all seemed to know and respect Fernando. Julia noticed how he took time with each person, asking about family members or farm concerns with genuine interest. Fernando Montero, a woman's voice cut through the crowd. I thought that was you. A beautiful blonde woman in an expensive-looking dress approached them, her high heels clicking on the pavement. Her smile was wide but didn't quite reach her eyes. Laura, Fernando said, his voice carefully neutral. I didn't know you were in town. Just visiting Daddy for the weekend, she said, her gaze sliding to Julia with obvious assessment. Aunt, you going to introduce me to your friend? Fernando's jaw tightened slightly. Laura Henderson, this is Julia Carter. Julia, Laura used to live in the area. Julia nodded politely, immediately understanding who this woman was, Fernando's ex-fiancée, who had found farm life too limiting. How charming, Laura said, her tone suggesting the opposite. Are you working at Monteverde, dear? Yes, Julia replied simply, refusing to be intimidated. I help run the kitchen. Laura's eyebrows rose. Oh, a cook. How useful. She turned back to Fernando. Speaking of useful, Daddy mentioned your Northfield might be for sale. Henderson Enterprises is very interested if you're finally ready to start developing some of that land. Fernando shook his head. Monteverde isn't for sale, Laura. Not a single acre. Laura pouted prettily, still stubborn as ever. Well, think about it. Daddy's offer is quite generous. She touched his arm familiarly. We should catch up properly while I'm in town. Dinner at the grill tomorrow? Before Fernando could respond, a man called Laura's name from across the square. She sighed. That's Daddy. I have to run. Call me Fernando. With a quick air kiss, she was gone, leaving a cloud of expensive perfume in her wake. An uncomfortable silence fell between Julia and Fernando. She's very beautiful, Julia finally said, hating the small voice inside that immediately compared herself unfavorably to the sophisticated blonde. Yes, Fernando agreed, then added, and completely wrong for Monteverde. He turned to Julia. I'm sorry about that. Laura can be intense. Julia shrugged, trying to appear unaffected. She obviously still cares for you. Laura cares about what she couldn't have, Fernando corrected. Once I made it clear I wouldn't sell the farm and move to the city with her, I stopped being interesting. He hesitated. Are you hungry? The church ladies set up a barbecue by the gazebo. Grateful. For the subject change, Julia nodded. They made their way through the crowd, but the easy rapport of earlier seemed strained now. Julia couldn't help wondering if seeing Laura had reminded Fernando of what he had given up. A beautiful, confident woman who moved through the world. Without fear, they found a table with some of the Monteverde workers and their families. The simple act of sharing a meal with these now familiar faces helped Julia relax again, and soon she was laughing at Tom's exaggerated story about a stubborn cow. As evening approached, the band shifted to slower songs and couples began dancing. In the area in front of the stage, Fernando watched them for a moment before turning to Julia. Would you like to dance? He asked quietly. Julia's first instinct was to refuse. Dancing meant being held, being close. But looking at Fernando, his expression open and patient, she found herself nodding. He led her to the edge of the dancing area and gently placed his hands on her waist, maintaining a respectful distance between their bodies. Julia, cautiously, rested her hands on his shoulders, and they began to sway to the music. I haven't danced in a long time, she admitted. You're doing fine, Fernando assured her. As the song continued, Julia gradually relaxed, allowing herself to move closer until she could feel the warmth of his body. Fernando's hands remained light on her waist, never straying or pulling her. Closer than she initiated. Thank you, she said softly. He looked down at her, puzzled. For what? For being patient, for never pushing. She met his eyes. For seeing me. Fernando's expression softened. Julia, you're easy to see. Your strength, your kindness. The way you care for everyone at the farm but take so little for yourself. His voice dropped lower. The way you're finally starting to smile again. The intensity of his gaze made her heart race, but not with fear. This was something entirely different, something warm and hopeful and terrifying in its own way. The song ended, but neither of them moved immediately. They stood there, connected in a moment that felt fragile and precious. Finally, Fernando stepped back slightly. Would you like to walk by the river? It's lit with lanterns for the festival. Julia nodded, suddenly unable to trust her voice. As they made their way through the crowd, Fernando lightly placed his hand at the small of her back, not guiding or controlling, just a gentle point of contact that sent tingles up her spine. The riverbank was indeed beautiful, with paper lanterns strung in the trees casting a soft glow over the water. Several couples and families were strolling along the path, but it was quieter than the main festival area. They walked slowly, talking about simple things, childhood memories, favorite books, dreams that had changed with time. Julia found herself sharing more than she had with anyone in years, drawn out by Fernando's attentive listening and thoughtful responses. I wanted to be a professional chef once, she confessed. I was even saving for culinary school. Then I met Mark, and somehow my dreams became smaller. More practical, he called it. Fernando frowned. There's nothing impractical about following your passion. That's what my mother always said. Julia smiled at the memory. She taught me to cook, said food made with love always tastes better. She was right, Fernando said. I've never tasted anything as good as what you create in our kitchen. Our kitchen. The simple phrase sent a wave of warmth through Julia. Somehow, in these few months, Monteverde had become more home to her than anywhere she'd lived in years. They reached a small wooden bench overlooking a bend in the river. Fernando gestured to it. Shall we sit for a while? The bench was small enough that their shoulders touched when they sat down. Julia didn't move away. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly into the contact, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Julia, Fernando said after a moment, I need to tell you something. Her body tensed automatically. In her experience, those words rarely preceded anything good. Fernando must have felt her reaction because he immediately gave her more space. It's nothing bad, he assured her. At least I hope not. She nodded for him to continue, trying to calm her racing heart. "I care about you," he said simply. "More than as a friend or employee. I didn't expect it, and I understand if you don't. Feel the same way. Your healing comes first, always." Julia stared at him, shocked not by his admission but by the careful way he presented it, making no demands, expecting nothing in return. When she didn't respond immediately, Fernando continued. "You don't need to say anything now, or ever, if you don't want to. I just thought you should know where I stand." "Fernando," she finally managed, "I don't know if I'm ready. I still have days when She struggled to explain the lingering fear that sometimes gripped her without warning. "I know," he said gently, "and that's okay. Healing isn't linear. It has good days and bad, steps forward and back." He looked out at the river. "My grandmother, he used to say that true feelings aren't rushed. They grow in their own time like everything worthwhile." Julia felt tears welling up, not from sadness or fear, but from the overwhelming realization that this man truly understood her, truly respected her journey. "Can we just," she began hesitantly, "can we take it slowly, day by day?" Fernando's smile was like sunrise. "We can take all the time you need." Summoning her courage, Julia reached out and took his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. It was a small gesture, but for her it was monumental, a deliberate choice to trust, to connect, to move forward. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lantern light dance on the water, their linked hands resting between them like a promise. The drive back to Monteverde was quiet, but peaceful. Julia found herself glancing at Fernando's profile in the dim dashboard light, marveling at how different he was from any man she'd known before. There was a steadiness to him, a patient strength that never demanded or intimidated. When they arrived at the farmhouse, Fernando walked her to the door, maintaining a respectful distance despite the evening's revelations. "Thank you for today," Julia said, standing on the porch steps. "I had a wonderful time." "So did I," Fernando replied. He hesitated, then asked, "Would you like to help me with the horses tomorrow morning? Sunday is usually quiet, and Dawn just had a new foal you might like to see." Julia smiled, realizing she genuinely wanted to learn more about his world beyond the kitchen. "I'd like that." "Good night, then," he said softly. In a moment of bravery, Julia leaned forward and quickly kissed his cheek. "Good night, Fernando." She hurried inside before she could see his reaction, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. In her room, she carefully hung up Maria's yellow dress and changed into her nightclothes. As she brushed her hair before the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman looking back at her, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, a small smile playing around her lips. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Julia fell asleep thinking, not of the past but of the future. The next morning dawned crisp and bright. Julia dressed in jeans and a warm sweater, pulling her hair back in a loose ponytail rather than her once habitual severe bun. She made her way to the kitchen where Maria was already preparing breakfast. "Someone's up early for a Sunday," Maria observed with a knowing smile. "Coffee?" Julia accepted the mug gratefully. "I'm helping Fernando with the horses this morning." Maria raised her eyebrows but made no comment, though her expression spoke volumes. Julia felt herself blushing under the older woman's gaze. "The festival was nice," she offered, trying to sound casual. "Mm-hmm," Maria hummed. "I noticed you and Fernando dancing." Before Julia could respond, the man himself appeared in the doorway, dressed in work clothes and boots. His face brightened when he saw her. "Good morning," he greeted them both, though his eyes lingered on Julia. "Ready for your first lesson in horse care?" Julia nodded, setting down her half-finished coffee. "Lead the way." The stables were warm and filled with the earthy smell of hay and horses. Fernando guided her down the center aisle, stopping in front of a stall where a beautiful chestnut mare stood protectively beside a wobbly-legged foal. "This is Dawn," Fernando said, "and her new daughter, who doesn't have a name yet." Julia approached the stall slowly. "They're beautiful. Would you like to feed them?" Dawn is very gentle. Under Fernando's patient guidance, Julia learned how to offer a carrot flat on her palm. She laughed with delight when the mare's soft muzzle tickled her hand. "She likes you," Fernando said, standing close behind her. The morning passed quickly as Fernando showed Julia around the stables, introducing her to each horse and explaining their personalities and needs. She listened attentively, asking questions, and gradually growing more comfortable around the large animals. "You're a natural," Fernando told her as they filled water troughs together. "Most city people are more nervous around horses." Julia smiled. "I was nervous at first, but they're so honest. There's something soothing about that." Fernando nodded. "Animals don't pretend, they're exactly who they are. No games, no hidden agendas." "Unlike people," Julia said softly. "Some people," Fernando corrected. "Not all." Their eyes met, and Julia felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. Fernando stepped closer, slowly enough that she could have moved away if she wanted to. She didn't. "Julia," he said, his voice low. "May I kiss you?" The question, so simple and direct, asking permission rather than taking, brought tears to her eyes. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Fernando cupped her face gently with one hand, giving her time to change her mind. Then he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it made her heart ache. It lasted only a moment, but when he pulled away, Julia felt as though something fundamental had shifted inside her, like the final stone being removed from a wall she had built around her heart. "Was that okay?" Fernando asked, his eyes searching. "Hers?" In answer, Julia reached up and pulled him down for another kiss, this one less hesitant. His arms wrapped around her waist, holding her securely but not too tightly, and she felt safe in a way she had forgotten was possible. When they parted, Fernando rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he admitted. "Me, too," Julia whispered. "I was just afraid." "And now?" She considered the question seriously. "Still a little afraid," she answered honestly, "but not of you, of feeling this much." Fernando nodded in understanding. "We'll take it one day at a time, remember? No rushing, no pressure." Julia smiled. "One day at a time." A soft whinny from Dawn's stall interrupted the moment. They turned to see the foal attempting its first few steps away from its mother, legs wobbling with the effort. "Look at that," Fernando said proudly. "She's already trying to explore." Julia watched the tiny horse's determination. "She needs a name." "Any suggestions?" Fernando asked. Julia thought for a moment, then said, "Hope. Her name should be Hope." Fernando's arm tightened around her waist. "It's perfect," he agreed. "Absolutely perfect." October brought brilliant colors to Monteverde Farm as the trees turned vibrant shades of gold and red. The days grew shorter and the evenings cooler, with a crispness in the air that spoke of the approaching winter. For Julia, the changing season mirrored the transformation happening in her own life. With each passing day, she found herself smiling more, standing taller, speaking with confidence. The kitchen had become truly hers, with Maria happily stepping back to let Julia's creativity shine. "These apple turnovers are even better than my mother's," Maria declared one morning, taking a bite of Julia's latest creation made from Fernando's grandmother's recipe. "And I would never admit that to anyone but you." Julia laughed, a free and easy sound that no longer surprised her. "The secret is browning the butter first," she confided, "and a pinch of cardamom." Their friendship had deepened over the months, with Maria becoming the maternal figure Julia had missed since losing her own mother years before. It was Maria who offered gentle advice as Julia's relationship with Fernando grew, never pushing, but always supportive. "He looks at you the way my Eduardo looked at me for 40 years, Maria told her one evening as they watched Fernando chopping wood outside the kitchen window. "Like you're the sun and moon all rolled into one." Julia blushed but didn't deny it. What had begun with that first kiss in the stables had blossomed into something she'd never experienced before, a relationship built on mutual respect, shared laughter, and genuine care. Fernando courted her with old-fashioned patience. They took long walks around the property in the evenings, rode horses together on Sunday mornings, and shared quiet conversations on the porch after dinner. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, seeming to treasure each small step forward as a gift. For her part, Julia found herself falling in love with not just Fernando, but with Monteverde itself, the rhythm of farm life, the connection to the land, the community that had welcomed her without question. She'd started a small herb garden behind the kitchen, planning for next spring's plantings, with an eye toward the future that surprised her. One crisp Saturday morning, while Julia was kneading bread dough, Fernando appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Have a surprise for you," he announced. "Can you take the afternoon off?" Julia glanced at Maria, who shooed her away. "Go. The bread can rise while you're gone, and I can handle dinner prep." "Let me just clean up," Julia said, wiping flour from her hands. 20 minutes later, she joined Fernando by his truck, curious about the mystery outing. He helped her into the passenger seat, but wouldn't reveal their destination despite her questions. "Patience," he teased as they drove away from the farm. "Some things are worth waiting for." They headed toward town but turned onto a country road Julia hadn't traveled before. After about 15 minutes, Fernando slowed the truck and pulled into a long driveway, leading to a small restaurant set in what looked like a converted farmhouse. A sign over the door read, "Harper's Harvest." "What is this place?" Julia asked as Fernando came around to open her door. "The best farm-to-table restaurant in the county," he replied, "run by a husband and wife team who grow most of their own produce. I thought you might find it interesting." Julia's pulse quickened with excitement as they entered. The interior was rustic but elegant, with wooden tables, fresh flowers, and large windows overlooking gardens and fields. A woman about Julia's age approached them with a warm smile. "Fernando, so good to see you again." "Sarah, this is Julia." Fernando introduced them. "Julia, Sarah Harper owns this place with her husband Ben." "Welcome to Harper's Harvest," Sarah said, shaking Julia's hand. "Fernando mentioned you're a chef?" "I was," Julia replied, then corrected herself. "I am." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Wonderful. I convinced Ben to give you the full tour if you're interested. Not many people appreciate the behind the scenes of a restaurant kitchen." Julia turned to Fernando in surprise. "You arranged all this?" He shrugged with a smile. "I thought you might enjoy seeing what they've built here. It's similar to what you once dreamed of." The next 2 hours were a revelation for Julia. Ben Harper, a tall man with a chef's confident manner, showed her every aspect of their operation, from the kitchen with its top-of-the-line equipment to the greenhouse, where they grew herbs and vegetables year-round. They even kept chickens and a small herd of goats for fresh eggs and cheese. "We wanted to create something that connected people back to their food," Ben explained as they walked through rows of fall vegetables. "Most folks have no idea where what they eat comes from anymore." "It's amazing," Julia said sincerely. "You've built something really special here." "It wasn't easy," Sarah admitted, joining them. "The first few years were brutal, 16-hour days, barely breaking even. But now," she gestured around proudly, "now we have a 3-month waiting list for weekend dinners and a cookbook coming out next spring." Throughout the tour, Fernando stayed slightly back, watching Julia engage passionately with the couple, asking detailed questions about everything from crop rotation to menu planning. Her eyes were bright with interest, her hands gesturing animatedly as she discussed cooking techniques with Ben. After the tour, they enjoyed a spectacular meal featuring the farm's seasonal produce. Julia savored each bite, analyzing flavors and presentations with professional appreciation. "Thank you," she said to Fernando as they drove back to Monteverde in the golden light of late afternoon. "That was inspiring." Fernando glanced at her with a smile. "You were different in there, more alive somehow." Julia nodded, understanding what he meant. "Cooking has always been my passion, seeing what they've created, how they've combined farming with food service." She trailed off, then admitted, "It made me think about possibilities I'd given up on." Fernando reached across to take her hand. "You can have any future you want, Julia. You're capable of so much more than you give yourself credit for." She squeezed his hand, grateful for his unwavering belief in her. "Monteverde has given me back parts of myself I thought were lost forever." The farm does have a way of healing people, Fernando agreed. "It's not just the farm," Julia said softly. They drove in comfortable silence the rest of the way, hands linked on the seat between them. When they arrived back at Monteverde, The setting sun cast long shadows across the fields, turning everything golden. Instead of driving directly to the house, Fernando took a detour toward the back pasture, stopping near a small rise overlooking the property. "I want to show you something else," he said, coming around to help her from the truck. He led her up the gentle slope to where a massive oak tree stood, its branches spread wide against the evening sky. A wooden bench had been placed beneath it, weathered by years of sun and rain. "I come here sometimes to think," Fernando explained as they sat side by side. "You can see almost the entire farm from this spot." Below them, Monteverde spread out, in a patchwork of fields, pastures, and buildings. Smoke curled lazily from the farmhouse chimney, and in the distance, cattle grazed peacefully. The beauty of it caught in Julia's throat. "It's breathtaking," she whispered. "My grandfather proposed to my grandmother under this tree," Fernando said, "and my father to my mother. It's a family tradition of sorts." Julia's heart began to race as she turned to look at him. Fernando's expression was serious but tender as he took both her hands in his. "Julia, these past months have been the happiest of my life," he said. "Watching you heal, seeing you bloom like a flower finally given sunlight, it's been a privilege. You're the strongest person I've ever known." Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not fear or pain. "Fernando, I'm not asking for an answer today," he continued, "but I want you to know that whenever you're ready, be it a month from now or a year, I'll be waiting. Because I love you, Julia, completely and without reservation." She felt the words resonate through her entire being, healing cracks she hadn't even known were still there. "I love you too," she said, the words coming easily, naturally. "You taught me how to breathe again, how to trust, how to believe in second chances." Fernando reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "This was my grandmother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple but beautiful ring with a single diamond. "I'm not proposing right now. I know you're still finding your way, but I want you to have this as a promise. When you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be here." Julia stared at the ring, overwhelmed by the moment. 6 months ago, she would have run from this, terrified of being trapped again. But Fernando wasn't offering a cage. He was offering freedom. The freedom to choose her own timing, her own path forward. "Keep it for now," she said gently. "Not because I don't love you, but because when I say yes, I want to be whole for both of us." Fernando nodded, understanding in his eyes as he closed the box. "However long it takes." He leaned forward and kissed her softly, a promise sealed without words. As they walked back to the truck hand in hand, Julia felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in years, the future looked bright with possibility instead of shrouded in fear. The weeks that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Julia. Each day brought new discoveries about herself, about Fernando, about the life they might build together. They fell into easy routines, working side by side on farm chores, sharing quiet evenings by the fireplace, planning for the upcoming holidays. November arrived with the first frost, silvering the fields each morning. Julia had never experienced a rural Thanksgiving before, and threw herself into preparations with enthusiasm, planning an elaborate feast for the entire farm staff. 2 days before the holiday, she was knee-deep in pie preparations when Martha burst into the kitchen, her face pale. "Julia, it's Fernando. There's been an accident in the north field. Tom just called from the truck. They're on their way to the hospital." Julia's hands froze on the rolling pin. "How bad?" "I don't know," Martha admitted. "Something about the tractor rolling. Tom said Fernando's conscious but in pain." The world narrowed to a pinpoint of fear as Julia rushed to clean her hands. "I need to go to him." Martha nodded. "I'll drive you." The 20-minute ride to the county hospital was the longest of Julia's life. Memories of her last hospital visit, after Mark had put her there with broken ribs, threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed them aside. Fernando needed her to be strong now. In the emergency room, they found Tom pacing the waiting area, his weathered face drawn with worry. "What happened?" Julia demanded. "Tractor hit a hidden ditch and tipped," Tom explained. "Boss was thrown clear, but his leg got caught. Doctors are with him now." Julia sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "But he's going to be okay?" Think so. Broken leg for sure, maybe a couple ribs. Could have been much worse. The next hour passed in agonizing slowness until a doctor finally emerged looking for Fernando's family. Julia stood, and something in her face must have convinced him because he addressed her directly. Mr. Montero has a compound fracture of the right tibia and 2 cracked ribs. We've set the leg and he'll need to stay overnight for observation, but he should make a full recovery with proper care and physical therapy. Relief washed over Julia like a wave. Can I see him? The doctor nodded. He's been asking for you. Room 204, down that hallway. Fernando lay in the hospital bed, his right leg elevated and encased in a temporary cast. His face was bruised on one side and he looked pale against the white sheets, but his eyes brightened when Julia entered the room. There you are, he said, reaching for her hand. Julia took it, fighting back tears. You scared me half to death. I'm sorry, he said sincerely. Wasn't part of my plan for the week. Despite everything, Julia found herself laughing softly. I should hope not. She sat beside his bed while the doctor explained Fernando's recovery process. 6 weeks in a cast, followed by physical therapy. He would need help with daily activities, especially at first. I'll take care of him, Julia said firmly when the doctor asked about home support. After the doctor left, Fernando squeezed her hand. Julia, you don't have to. Yes, I do, she interrupted. Because I love you, and that's what people who love each other do. They take care of each other. Fernando's eyes softened. It won't be pretty. I make a terrible patient, according to my mother. I can handle it, Julia assured him. I'm stronger than I look, remember? The next few weeks proved challenging but deepened their bond in unexpected ways. Julia moved her belongings into Fernando's room to better care for him, helping him navigate the painful process of healing. She learned to administer medication, change dressings, and provide the physical support he needed with quiet efficiency. For a man accustomed to constant activity, forced immobility was difficult. Fernando grew frustrated at times, but never directed his anger at Julia. Instead, he channeled his energy into farm management from his bed, reviewing accounts and making plans for spring planting. Christmas approached, bringing a festive atmosphere to Monteverde, despite Fernando's condition. Julia decorated the farmhouse with evergreen boughs and ribbons, filling the house with the scents of pine and spices. On Christmas Eve, after a special dinner with the entire farm staff, Julia helped Fernando to their bedroom. His mobility had improved somewhat with a walking cast and crutches, but stairs remained difficult. Once he was settled in the armchair by the window, Julia surprised him by pulling a small gift-wrapped box from her dresser drawer. I have something for you, she said, suddenly nervous as she placed it in his hands. Fernando looked at her curiously before carefully unwrapping the package. Inside was a small wooden box. When he opened it, his breath caught. Nestled on a bed of velvet was his grandmother's ring. Are you sure? He asked, his voice barely audible. Julia knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. These past weeks have shown me something important, she said. When you were hurt, I wasn't afraid to step up, to be strong for both of us. I realized I'm not broken anymore, Fernando. I'm whole again. Stronger at the broken places maybe, but whole. Fernando's eyes shone with emotion. What are you saying, Julia? I'm saying yes, she answered simply. Yes to your promise, yes. To building a life together. Yes to loving you every day for the rest of my life. With trembling fingers, Fernando removed the ring from its box. Will you marry me, Julia Carter? Will you make Monteverde your home forever? It already is my home, she said as he slipped the ring onto her finger. You already are my home. Their kiss sealed the promise, gentle but filled with the certainty of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came the renewal of both the land and Fernando's health. By March, his cast was removed, though he still walked with a slight limp that the doctor assured would fade with time and exercise. Julia blossomed in her new role as Fernando's fiancée and partner in running Monteverde. She expanded her herb garden and started planning a small farm-to-table program inspired by Harper's Harvest, where local families could come for special weekend dinners featuring Monteverde's own produce. You're going to need help, Fernando observed one evening, as they reviewed her plans. "This is too much for you and Maria to handle alone." "I've been thinking about that," Julia admitted. "What about hiring a culinary student for the summer? Someone who could learn while helping?" Fernando smiled. "Like an apprentice program? I like it. Maybe we could partner with the community college." They were discussing the details when Martha knocked on the study door. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see Julia." Julia frowned, not expecting visitors. "Who is it?" "Says his name is Mark Johnson from Chicago." The blood drained from Julia's face. Fernando immediately reached for her hand, his expression concerned. "Do you want me to send him away?" he asked, quietly. Julia's first instinct was to hide, to run, but then she looked down at Fernando's hand holding hers, felt the weight of his grandmother's ring on her finger, and something settled inside her. "No," she said firmly. "I'll talk to him." Fernando nodded. "I'll be right here if you need me." Mark waited in the living room, looking out of place in his expensive city clothes. He turned when Julia entered, his familiar face both strange and disturbing to her now. He was handsome in the conventional way that had once impressed her, but his eyes held none of the warmth that Fernando's did. "Julia," he said, stepping toward her. "Finally. You're hard to track down." She remained by the door, keeping her distance. "What are you doing here, Mark?" He spread his hands in a gesture of peace. "I wanted to see you, talk to you. Your old roommate finally told me where you were." His eyes narrowed. "A farm, Julia? Really? This is what you ran away for?" "I didn't run away," she corrected. "I left an abusive relationship to save myself." Mark's expression darkened momentarily before he forced a smile. "Look, we both said and did things we regret. I've changed. I've been in therapy, anger management. I came to apologize and—" He paused. "To ask you to come home. We can start fresh." 6 months ago, those words might have swayed her, might have reawakened the part of her that had always tried to please him, to fix things. Now they fell flat. "This is my home now," she said calmly, "and I'm engaged to be married." Mark's facade cracked slightly, anger flashing across his features. "To some hick farmer? Come on, Julia, you're better than this place. We had plans." "No, you had plans," Julia corrected. "Plans that never included what I wanted." She straightened her shoulders. "I think you should leave now." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to the persuasive tone she remembered all too well. "Julia, baby, don't be hasty. Whatever this guy's offering you, I can do better. Remember the condo we looked at? The one on Michigan Avenue? It's still available. We could have that life." "I don't want that life," Julia said firmly. "I want this one, with Fernando, with Monteverde." Mark's expression hardened. "So that's his name? Fernando?" He scoffed. "What does he have that I don't?" "Kindness," Julia answered immediately. "Respect. The ability to love without trying to control." "You've gotten mouthy," Mark observed coldly. "That's not like you." "You never knew the real me," Julia replied. "You only knew the version of me that was too afraid to speak up." Mark's face flushed with anger. "I drove 8 hours to get here, and this is how you treat me? After everything I did for you?" "Everything you did to me," Julia corrected quietly. "And yes, this is how I'm treating you, with honesty. Something you never gave me." She saw his hands clench into fists, a familiar precursor to his temper. But instead of cringing as she once would have, Julia stood her ground. "If you raise your voice or make one threatening move, my fiancé and 6 ranch hands will be in this room before you can blink," she warned. "This is my home, Mark. You have no power here." Something in her steady gaze must have convinced him, because he took a step back, his expression shifting to contempt. "You've changed." "Thank God for that," Julia said. For a moment she thought he might argue further, but Mark finally shrugged, his demeanor switching to casual dismissal, another tactic she remembered well. "Your loss," he said. "When you get tired of playing, farmer's wife, don't come crawling back." He moved toward the door. "I won't be waiting. I won't be coming," Julia assured him. After Mark left, Julia stood in the center of the living room, trembling not with fear, but with a powerful sense of closure. Fernando appeared in the doorway, his eyes questioning. "Are you okay?" he asked. Softly, Julia crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. breathing in the familiar scent of his shirt, laundry soap, sunshine, and the faint trace of horses. "I'm better than okay," she whispered. "I'm free." Fernando held her close. "He's gone?" "Forever," Julia confirmed. "He has no hold on me anymore." That night, as they sat on the porch watching stars appear in the darkening sky, Julia rested her head on Fernando's shoulder. "I want a spring wedding," she said suddenly, "right here at Monteverde." Fernando smiled. "Wherever and whenever you want." "Not in the house," Julia continued, ideas flowing freely. "Down by the big oak tree where your grandfather proposed, with flowers from the garden and Maria's famous wedding cake." "It sounds perfect," Fernando agreed. "Just like you." Julia laughed softly. "I'm far from perfect, but I'm whole, and I'm happy." "That's all I ever wanted for you," Fernando said, kissing the top of her head. They sat in peaceful silence as night settled fully over Monteverde Farm. In the distance, an owl called, and somewhere in the stables, a horse nickered softly. These sounds that had once been foreign to Julia now represented home in the deepest sense. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and brilliant, with spring sunshine warming the fields of Monteverde. Julia stood at her bedroom window looking out at the preparations visible below. White chairs arranged in neat rows beneath the ancient oak tree, flowers and ribbons decorating a simple wooden arch. Maria bustled in, carrying a garment bag. "Almost time," she said, her eyes misty. "Are you ready?" "More than ready," Julia replied with a smile. The dress they had chosen together was simple but beautiful, ivory lace with a flowing skirt that moved like water when she walked. Maria helped her into it, then arranged her hair in loose waves. Crowned with a circlet of wildflowers from the farm's meadows. "You look like an angel," Martha declared when she entered with a bouquet of spring blooms. "Fernando won't be able to speak when he sees you." A knock at the door revealed Tom in his Sunday best, looking uncomfortable but proud. "Boss is waiting at the oak," he reported. "Guests are all seated." He paused, then added gruffly, "You need someone to walk you down the aisle. I'd be honored if you'll have me." Tears pricked Julia's eyes. "I'd like that very much, Tom." The walk from the farmhouse to the oak tree became a moment suspended in time. Julia on Tom's arm, the scent of flowers filling the air, faces turning to watch her approach. But all she truly saw was Fernando waiting beneath the arch, his eyes never leaving hers. He wore a new suit but had foregone a tie, looking both handsome and completely himself. As Julia reached him, Tom placed her hand in Fernando's with a nod of approval before taking his seat. "You're breathtaking," Fernando whispered. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt. They exchanged simple vows they had written themselves, promising to respect, support, and cherish one another through whatever life brought their way. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Fernando cupped Julia's face gently in his hands before kissing her. The assembled guests, farm workers, townspeople, and friends they had made together erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed was everything Julia had dreamed. Tables set up on the lawn, strings of lights hanging from tree branches, music and laughter filling the air. The meal featured produce from Monteverde and dishes Julia had prepared, with Maria over the preceding days, a true farm-to-table wedding feast. As evening approached, Fernando led Julia away from the festivities to a quiet spot overlooking the property that had brought them together. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Julia leaned back against his chest, watching the sunset paint Monteverde in shades of gold. "Completely," she answered. "I never imagined finding this kind of happiness after what happened with Mark. You gave me back my future." Fernando shook his head. "You did that yourself. I just had the privilege of witnessing it." She turned in his arms to face him. "You taught me to breathe again. Now I want you to teach me to stay, for all the days to come." "That," Fernando said, kissing her softly, "will be my greatest joy." Behind them the party continued, music and laughter drifting up from the celebration of their union. Before them stretched Monteverde Farm, their home and haven, the place where a woman running from pain had found healing in the arms of a man who knew how to wait, how to care, how to love without conditions. Julia had arrived with her heart, fenced off from the world. Now she stood as Fernando's wife, her heart open to all the possibilities their life together would bring, from the fence to the altar and beyond.